Hello folks, it's me, DeMontropolis, and today I'll be wrapping up the NES trilogy of Castlevania with its third and final entry, Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse. Developed by Konami and released so late into 1989 it might as well be a 1990 game, Dracula's Curse had the advantage of taking inspiration from two very different games in order to craft arguably the finest and most realized entry. For this review, I'll be primarily looking at the American version, as there are actually quite a bit of differences with the Famicom release. For one, the Japanese version supported a VRC6 chip, which allowed for extra sound channels than what you normally hear. The Japanese version also has a lot of gameplay changes that generally make the game easier and a bit less refined in my opinion, such as with how the bosses turn out. Thankfully, the American version adjusts those, but I will still discuss more differences later down the line. Now, are you all excited for this one? I hope the wait was well worth it, so grab your snacks and sit back as I delve into how this game solidified the series' reputation and embraced it head-on. Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse. Not even a second in, and you are blessed with this game's prelude. One of the best I've ever seen in any game. That movie reel effect seen in the previous two games is now fully animated and showing clip by clip, with a shot of Draculas Castle and lightning bringing the title card into view. Notice how the lightning doesn't overpower the music here, a level of detail that I've seen brushed aside in previous games that I've covered. The story here details that since this is 15th century Europe, we are now 2 centuries before Simon Belmont's time. In fact, the Belmonts were actually feared by the townspeople and exiled from Wallachia, but the one remaining Belmont, Trevor, was called into action as a last resort. Now it's just Trevor Belmont against the curse of Dracula in one of his earliest campaigns against humanity. Graphically, Dracula's Curse is the most gorgeous looking out of any Castlevania game seen so far. Presentation is perfected and nothing misses a beat with how meticulous everything is illustrated. The best examples include the darkened interior of a cathedral in Block 1 only illuminated by stained glass, and the shadow-shrouded forest in Block 3, sidelit by both torches and the moon. Even just the little things like how Trevor's prayer is set up at the beginning and how his movements are synced to the music go a long way. Character sprites got a tremendous upgrade too. Looking at the bone-throwing skeletons, for example, they actually have a throwing animation instead of just throwing up. The Axe Knights have telegraphs to which altitude they throw their axe in, tasking you with having to react to that telegraph accordingly. And that kind of detail is everywhere. Even just comparing the sprites between Trevor here and Simon in the past 2 games, you can tell that Trevor is a lot more sleek and masculine, especially with how cool he looks walking up and down stairs. But the soundtrack though, I am not being hyperbolic when I say this is among the best ever made for the NES. Absolute AAA quality here. Every song is cleverly matched up with its appropriate stage, even for the ones that get used more than once. Stages that want you to feel confident in your abilities may use Aquarius, whereas a more claustrophobic setting will use Anxiety or Nightmare. The latter used to terrify me and scare me away from playing that underground stage, and that can be attributed to how eerie and atonal the song is. Regardless of all this variety, every song has a good place in this game, and I love them all. My favorites would go to Beginning, Deadbeat, and Riddle, but an honorable mention goes to that boss theme. The nostalgia of that Skeleton Knight's jittery walk animation has been burned into my retinas every time I hear that song. In terms of gameplay, Dracula's Curse returns to the first Castlevania style of level design. Interestingly so, because all the games in between 1 and 3 never really did so. Dracula's Curse happily brings back elements of the original, with each section and checkpoint of a block being marked by doors, now having a more variable number of them. Levels are also designated as blocks instead of each section being its own stage, which is a more cleaner way to display the area you're in. And while yes, it is heavily based on the first game's formula, all that I mentioned is just surface level information. Compared to the first game, Dracula's Curse shares a lot of the same philosophy in terms of platforming, but now there's a huge emphasis on vertical platforming. This allows for many new types of challenges to be done, and believe me when I say Dracula's Curse makes the most out of this untapped concept. This can range from simple areas that scroll at your own leisure, those that scroll upward or downward at a set pace, or even those that dramatically ratchet, perfectly emulating the pressure of a collapsing tower. And given that Trevor is generally more restrictive moving up and down stairs, it's impressive how natural most of these vertical sections turned out to be. Although there is this huge push towards verticality, Dracula's Curse suffers from the same stairway issues that plagued the first game's controls. Using a sub-weapon near these stairs will magnetize your feet to them, and trying to use them on stairs is like declaring war on your shoot button. It might also just be me, but accidentally walking off a platform to your death because you didn't press up or down to get to the stairs feels way more common here, and dumb mistakes like that are punished just as hard as the more valiant and respectable deaths. One change that is more immediate to notice is the branching paths and alternate routes available to you. There are 3 possible areas you can branch off to before they all converge at Draculas Castle, and I like how versatile the selections are. Each one has a noticeable difficulty to them, some choices leading to easier or harder blocks, or optional blocks entirely. Since this is pivoted to the player's discretion, playing the game more and more will evolve your understanding of these paths, and allow you to get the most out of your adventure on repeated playthroughs. As for Trevor's sub-weapons, he is pretty much the same 5 as Simon's in the first game. One problem with Castlevania 1 was that the holy water was so OP that it invalidated most of the game's challenge and neutered every boss. Dracula's Curse solves this by better encouraging the use of other sub-weapons besides holy water. There are way more flying enemies and bosses across the game, and they rarely touch the ground. With all the vertical sections throughout, that also means less ground for holy water to erupt into flames. Thus, sub-weapons like the axe and even the dagger are given many opportunities to take center stage. The holy water is also nerfed, but nerfed just enough that it can still feel really powerful in its own right. Enemies like hunchbacks and Medusa heads no longer get one shot by the vial itself, and while it still traps enemies inside the flame, this does not apply for bosses. Instead, holy water merely slows down their movement, but to compensate, it does damage at a much faster rate. So in a nutshell, holy water is pretty much situational or outright useless against flying enemies, but once you find a grounded foe, holy water will rip through them faster than ever before. There are a few problems with these sub-weapons though. The first of which is that enemies are more likely to drop them in your way. It increases the chances of you accidentally walking into one and messing up your game plan. Granted, item drops appear as soon as an enemy is killed, versus the first game where there was a slight delay. This makes it a bit easier to notice an unwanted item drop in your path, but it's a mechanic that only really benefits miscellaneous items. Speaking of which, I have never actually seen enemies drop said items, like rosaries or invisibility potions, which is a bit of a shame. That also means that the one invisibility potion in the game, found in block 4A, is the only one you'll ever see in the game. You can miss it too, and given that there are only 2 enemies surrounding this potion, I don't blame you if you forgot about it. The most intriguing mechanic this game has to offer though, is the opportunity to come across 3 unique characters and recruit them to your side. You're guaranteed to come across one character regardless of the paths you choose, and each of these new characters have a unique playstyle that can be exploited to make the game a whole lot easier. This system does have the limitation of Trevor only being able to have one ally at a time, but I never thought of that as a problem. No matter which combo you have, this whole system allows you to go through each portion of the game differently, as each character's unique playstyle encourages you to approach challenges in new ways. Keep in mind you are also not obligated to accept an ally's help, and if you really wanted to, you can solo the entire game with only Trevor. It's a daunting challenge, but just like with the branching path system, each combo offers a ton of replay value, owing to the wide range of difficulty covered. You can make the game as easy or as hard as you want, but even the easiest possible combination will still give you a run for your money and ensure you come out of Dracula's Curse satisfied. It never gets old, and I don't see this system losing its charm anytime soon. But let's actually talk about these characters. The guy you start with is obviously Trevor Belmont, but it's important to acknowledge the strengths he has, which lie in his versatility and ability to conquer most challenges head-on. There are very few situations where he can't handle his own, as the entire game design is molded around his core attributes. He is not gimmicky like the other characters, but that's the beauty of Trevor's playstyle. While doing my research, I came across this analogy online, and I loved how well it put Trevor into perspective with everyone else. If Dracula's Curse is a jazz standard, Trevor provides the steady beat against which the other characters allow you to improvise. The first character you are likely to come across is Grant Dynasty. If you accept this pirate's aid, you'll be rewarded with a mobility-based character done right. Compared to everyone else, Grant walks faster, jumps higher, and is the only character who can alter his jump trajectory. Combine that with his useful ability to cling and move along walls and ceilings, and he's very flexible in getting out of danger. Grant can also skip various sections, usually by climbing over walls that would force other characters to take the stairs under those walls and pop out on the other side. Despite all these great strengths, Grant is more squishy, and his signature knife isn't very strong. This attack was actually nerfed from the Japanese version, where Grant was basically given free daggers to throw. While that made him OP, it was very slow and made his engagement in combat feel dull and empty. I figured the devs thought it was more fun to shank enemies to death, thanks to the stab's faster attack speed, and it helped give Grant a more hit-and-run approach. Grant's irregular movement also doesn't overshadow Trevor's more straightforward approach to platforming, as Grant may struggle to jump over areas when there's a ceiling that he could bonk his head on. If you take the game's main upper route, you'll stumble upon Saifa Belnades. This magician has similar downsides that Grant has, taking more damage from enemies and having a weak staff attack. But that's not why you use Saifa. Instead of getting the same sub-weapons as Trevor, Saifa has 3 unique spells, each being so OP it makes her the most fun character in the game. Oh, right, spoiler, Saifa's a woman. Her fire spell covers the same range as Trevor's full power whip, but does twice the damage and lingers in place for a bit, independent of Saifa's aerial movement. Keep in mind, this is Saifa's weakest magic. Her ice spell freezes any enemy within a close proximity and allows her to instantly shatter them with her staff, regardless of how tough that enemy was. This even applies to normally unkillable enemies like blood skeletons or those terrain scaling fuzzbusters, but her lightning spell is the most insane. Each of these 3 orbs have both the same power as a single fire spell and homing capabilities. This means they can not only hit enemies hiding well out of range from normal attacks, but also smack one large enemy multiple times for the strongest attack in the game. And with all these spells only costing 1 heart, Saifa has so much freedom to annihilate anything in her path. If this game was a political cartoon, Saifa would be the largest character from how freaking powerful she is. Fat Saifa, the panel would read. I also like how some sub-weapons are given these very cool interactions. In the first fight with a Cyclops, it is stormy outside. This is where Trevor and Grant's dagger can actually become a lightning knife. If you throw your dagger at the right time, the normally aesthetic lightning strikes will get attracted by the dagger's metal and shock the Cyclops for a quarter of his health. Saifa's ice spell also has a unique interaction with rushing water, freezing the entire stream. This stops the current for a bit, freezes any fishmen who are inside the water, and even lets Saifa walk on the icy surface unharmed. For how subtle these interactions are, they add a lot to engaging with the environment. Unfortunately, the ball was dropped with the last character. Alucard is found in the main lower route, and he is the worst character in the game by far. Alucard's main fireball attack is slow and does pitiful damage, and although you can upgrade it to shoot 3 fireballs in a spread that covers a lot of range, each is even weaker than the main attacks of Grant and Sypha. He also has no unique sub-weapons, other than the stopwatch that everyone can use. His only saving grace is the ability to turn it into a bat and fly anywhere on screen, which can be very useful for skipping certain areas. The best application is if Trevor gets knocked into a pit, he can switch to Alucard and recover from a fatal fall. As a bat though, he cannot defend himself and will be booted out of flying if anything damages him. And although you can switch back right away, it is rather clunky to do so and will eat up many hearts. Alucard also cannot attack on stairs. I don't even understand why this is the case. It's a basic character mechanic that everyone should be applicable for. But I guess Alucard can't do it because they forgot to sprite an animation for him doing so? Seems like a complete oversight, given how meticulous this game has been with its attention to detail and mechanics. One poor thing about bringing along a buddy is that any deaths you take will be made even more punishing. This is because you not only have to restore Trevor's whip back to full power and get him a sub-weapon, but the other character needs to get their sub-weapon as well. It's especially tedious if Alucard is your ally, as that makes for 2 characters who need to upgrade their attack twice each just to rise above suck status. While the first game is well known for having secret goodie items pop out of nowhere if you behave a certain way, the third game does away with this. Instead, the secrets and goodies found in Dracula's Curse are better designed to be in more visually noticeable locations and pique your interest. This is usually in the form of a candle or breakable wall that is either placed in a treacherous location, or a place that's out of reach and can only be accessed with a specific character. 1-ups especially are more common throughout the game and overall in really good spots, so if you know where they are, you don't have to rely just on points in order to acquire 1-ups. One simple example is in Block 2. At first, this room acts as a simple break area with Trevor, but when you come back here after learning about Grant's wall climbing capabilities, you are rewarded for your curiosity with a precious 1-up. Unfortunately, the game has a lot of areas that may look like places that secret goodies could be placed, only for them to have nothing along those lines, and thus end up being a waste of time. It's so weird, because there are many areas like this, and if a player doesn't get rewarded for checking it out, that'll diffuse their curiosity going forward. Taking a look at the new naming system, where you can input a name before starting off a playthrough, I like how there's some cool secrets within this naming system. If you input "Help Me," you can start off with 10 lives, a useful crutch for those who may be getting beaten up a little too much. You can also use different names to either do second quest as Trevor right away, or start off the game with an ally right away, and you are actually rewarded for doing so in Block 1, where there's a high-up point bag worth 7,000 points that only Grant and Alucard can reach. These special names are exclusive to the American version, by the way, and fun fact, the 4 names used for these, besides "Help Me," are actually names of the game's developers. Speaking of the American version, there are quite a lot of improvements from the Japanese version done to make the game more stable and clean. In the transition to the American version, there's quite a few graphical polishes here and there, but in terms of gameplay, it is best seen with the enemies and bosses. Many of them got health buffs so they could put up more of a fight, and even some boss AIs were refined for the better. See, in the Japanese version, the 2 mummy men used to walk very slowly and only throw bandages in a straight line. The Cyclops would sometimes wander randomly and ignore the player, and every Cyclops arena had a gap below the rightmost platform, allowing the player to be completely safe from the Cyclops' advances. The 2 water dragons looked uglier, and the way their fire breath was animated and angled, it very easily lagged the game every time they attacked. Now let's begin our quest through the game's blocks, and I'll be mentioning specific ones that stand out much more than the others. Block 1 has Trevor going through a wrecked town of Wallachia, likely Grezit for you Netflix fans, starting with a giant cathedral he was praying to. Ironic, given how much trouble the church was causing him in the show, but anyway, After an introductory area to get your bearings, you'll notice right away that Block 1 isn't afraid to step up the difficulty right away, making the game's increased complexity clear from the start, but without pushing it beyond your understanding. The first vertical section is very simple, but easy to fall off by accident, and coming out of there, you'll come across bone-throwing skeletons. These were enemies introduced in the first game's Block 3, almost halfway through the game, and here, they're one of your earliest enemies. One particular section also introduces these flipping platforms and Medusa heads together, but does so in a way that both patterns can be learned in safe environments. While it's a bit long for a starting level, Block 1 serves as a great way to ease you back into the world of Castlevania. Now here is your first branching path. Going down takes you to Block 3's Mad Forest right away, and even going through a unique section with 3 spike presses, placed in a way that references the first game. Going up, though, takes you to an optional stage, but one that is well worth it. Block 2 is this visually beautiful clock tower, a location typically known for being one of the last stages in your Castlevania game. Instead, it's the second level, and a very vertical one, but consists less of enemy combat and more about navigating the many platforms, from swinging pendulums to large gears that rotate you as you stand on them. This is where Dracula's Curse truly flexes its tech muscles, carefully making sure that foreground and background are distinguishable at all times, even with all the unique platforms. It also establishes the link between clock towers and Medusa heads, a combo that works in part due to their sudden appearances forcing you to adapt, even if you are on such unstable terrain. But that's not all, because after you save Grant, you have to do this level again, but in reverse, and it's done in a way that allows Grant's maneuverability to take center stage. It's easier to go down than it is to go up after all, but it really speaks to the quality of the game's level design with how well it got pulled off here. Leaving the clock tower takes you to Block 3's Mad Forest, and this is where the game really gets to have fun with enemies native to certain blocks. The actual forest has these owls who rise from the shadows to swoop down at you. In a way, they could be more dangerous than Ninja Gaiden's birds because you can't outrun them. They will swoop a second time at breakneck speeds. Thus, you are rewarded for your patience. Killing them before they can fly is key to making it out alive. If you continue Block 3 when given another branching path choice, you'll meet these floating spore mushrooms. They either float about or remain stationary, and regardless of how you approach them, be it attacking or evading them, they will get a chance to pop and release little spores. It's a neat defense mechanism, especially when using the cross against them to pull off these cool combos. Returning enemies are also given a chance to improve upon their tactics. Many skeletons have learned how to adapt armor and weaponry, like swords and even whips. Mixing those whip attacks with blood skeletons makes for a very engaging enemy. Crows have become larger ravens that more accurately hunt you down, and bone pillars are placed in positions that maximize the potential of both the upper and lower heads. All these enemies' executions are well coordinated. Now we're going into mid-game stages. If you took the main upper route to cut through the giant lake, you'll be blessed with both Sypha Belnatus and a set of blocks that introduce some really good gimmicks and challenges, ones that are given proper care before being used in the grand finale. Block 4A, the Haunted Ship of Fools, is a slow-paced level with very few enemies to interfere with your understanding of basic gimmicks, like seesaw platforms, collapsing blocks, and rows of descending platforms. Block 5A, the Red Tower, is another vertical level, and the whole gimmick of ratchet scrolling is executed very well without overwhelming the player with quick enemies, for this first usage at least. Block 6A, the Aqueducts, has rushing water and collapsing bridges, allowing for fun spectacle. And Block 7A, the Courtyard, takes all the gimmicks introduced in Block 4A and throws them into more challenging scenarios. There's especially this one pixel-perfect jump, but since there are no enemies to harass you, you can take as much time as you need for that one. Now, it might sound like I'm making the main upper route seem like the superior route that you should always pick for a good time, While that is an opinion that can be ubiquitously agreed on, that's not to say the main lower route has fun blocks too, providing some good challenge to offset the sour pace of the bad levels, and we'll get to those bad levels soon. Block 4 wins the award for funniest name, being called the Murky Marsh of Morbid Morons. But really, this block 2 has unique and fun enemies like these bullfrogs who get way too close for comfort, and looming mudmen who rise from the swamp. And both enemies are fun to rack up combos on using the cross. Block 6 is the castle basement, accessed if you finish Block 5 in its entirety. While it is the shortest block in the game, its platforming sections may remind you of the first game's Block 4, especially when you remember who the boss is. I like the flow of this one, as while there are perilous challenges over pits and water, taking it slow helps you ease into it. Also, the wall chicken is hidden inside stalagmites, and I always thought that was an impressive hiding spot. If you ignore the final chunk of Block 5, you'll come over to Block 6S, the Sunken City of Poltergeists. It starts off pretty tame with the fishmen and bats, but slowly introduces you to the bone dragons who make their home here. They're much more fun to fight here, as they only shoot fireballs straight forward and can be reacted to much easier. I should also mention that Alucard is really good in this block, as he can hold his own against most enemies and skip the first 2 bone dragons that he'd normally have trouble with. The real magic happens after the boss, because when you get close to defeating the Bone Dragon King, he just retreats and cracks a hole in the ceiling, bringing you the most anxiety-inducing set piece in the game. The water is rising slowly, and Trevor has no choice but to press on as quickly as he can while killing anything trying to stop him. It's one of the toughest challenges the game has to offer, as everything, even the blocks you stand on, are trying to kill you, and you cannot waste time. The boss also has to be finished off, while the water gets ever closer to drowning you. Despite all these odds, the satisfaction of triumphing this block is immense, and you can even get a 1-up for being fast enough to take a quick pit stop at a dead end. Unfortunately, the other 2 blocks in the main lower route stick out like a sore thumb, and lead to this lower route being overall more harrowing and tedious than the upper route. This creates a more frustrating difficulty gap between the 2 routes, and while you can just ignore this whole route entirely on replays, that ruins the whole point of non-linearity, especially when there are still enjoyable blocks like I discussed. It's also the route that houses Alucard, another excuse for players to stay away from here. Block 5 is the Underground Passage, being the longest stage in the game. It's also very slow and claustrophobic, with its main gimmick being these acidic droplets that melt away blocks over time. While you could just ignore them, sometimes they'll open up to the lower area where you can get a 1-up, and y'all know how much I like 1-ups. This means that I have to sit back and wait for these acidic droplets to do their trick, not engaging with the game whatsoever. If you even stay on this lower path, certain, if you only have Trevor at this point, you'll actually be forced to wait. It's Simon's Quest design all over again. Block 5 is also home to some of the worst enemies in the game. The firemen leave a trail of flames behind as they walk, so after you kill them, you'll usually be forced to wait until the flames go away. Only by killing them very quickly can you stop them from leaving behind those flames. The worst are these mummy enemies. Once you enter their area, they will infinitely spawn in front of and behind you in great numbers and immediately spam you with bandages. They'll eat Alucard alive, so unless you have the holy water to kill them as they materialize, you'll be trapped inside, and the section after Alucard's battle really loves hitting you with these mummies, making it frustrating to try and explore any goodies within their general vicinity. There's one area where if you don't move in a very specific way, you'll be taking unfair damage next to a nearby staircase that stops you from using a helpful sub-weapon. It's so bad it actually deters me from seeking out the big heart in that breakable wall. Block 7 though, this is easily the worst block in the game. The Mountain Mines level design is rushed and stands out for all the wrong reasons. It recycles the acidic drops from Block 5 and making you wait for them to carve the way, but it also has these blocks that fall down in a similar manner. There's one area where you need to wait for the blocks to pile up in order to reach a higher area, which has a neat challenge thanks to those shield gargoyles, but after the mid-boss, it is taken in the worst possible direction. After walking out of the door, you are abruptly placed in the middle of the screen somehow, while a block falls on your head right away. With nowhere to go, all you can do from here is avoid the blocks as they, very slowly, pile up. It is egregious. There's not even any enemies to interact with. You're just forced to internalize this dull block pattern just so you don't get knocked off and have to risk doing it all again. By the way, that said pattern abruptly changes halfway through just to throw you off. Surviving this entire section takes almost 3 minutes of your life away. If you have Alucard, he can thankfully fly to the stairs without having to wait, but even then, the second block pattern has blocks that clip through the stairs themselves. It's like the gimmick's attempt at a last laugh before you never see it again. The rest of the block isn't much better. After the auto-scroller, you are given 2 stairs to take. The left stairs rewards you with the wall chicken and ends off with an axe knight. He's fun to fight. But if you take the right stairs though, you don't get that wall chicken, just thrown into a mummy ambush, the lower route's last chance to give you the middle finger. A first playthrough across this block is going to be rough no matter how you approach it, and may inadvertently sour your impression on the game as a whole. Before moving on to the final few blocks, let's touch upon the bosses, as many of them are made more complex and engaging. Block 1's boss, Skull Knight, is much more intimidating than the Phantom Bat, as he's always walking towards you and his sword outranges your whip, but he is still susceptible to an easy defeat from Holy Water. Frankenstein's creature is not assisted by Igor Hunchbacks, but he can carry his own thanks to a move borrowed from his Haunted Castle battle, and he's no longer chained up. He really does like trying to bury you in debris, huh? The water dragons in Block 6A are fun for their simplicity, as while they only have one short fire breath, one wrong step of yours can send you to the waters. Lastly, the 2 mummy men are smarter and actually tough to evade, a substantial improvement from their pitiful encounter in the first game. Generally speaking, any pattern taken from the first game and brought back here has been refined for the better. There are several bosses though that get reused a bit too much depending on the route you take. As much as I like the giant bat for splitting into smaller bats and getting that sweet quick kill, he appears again in Block 7, the level known for recycling mechanics in the worst way possible. Speaking of recycling, there's a recurring boss called the Evil Flame, who resurrects fallen enemies in a mini gauntlet. You fight it twice in the main upper route and once in the main lower route, for a total of 3 times. The enemies are always the same too, Mummy Men first, Cyclops second, and eventually the Leviathan. Due to the Cyclops also being fought on his own in the main upper route, this ultimately means you have to fight the Cyclops a total of 3 times for that route. Don't get me wrong, that boss is fun, but it does feel a little lazy when more unique boss concepts could have been fleshed out instead. Some bosses are unfair fighting them without any help from sub-weapons. The Skull Knight King at the end of Block 5 is a stronger version of the boss of Block 1, but every time he gets hit, he releases bones to fly around the screen in an erratic way. Even if you drop your offense for a second, the bones will get you. He also has twice the health, so there ain't no way you can overpower him with just the whip. The Bone Dragon King isn't too egregious, but he did kick off the tradition of annoying movements that lock onto your position like a heat-seeking missile, and given your controls in Castlevania, that's typically a very tough kind of movement to dodge. The Doppelganger is a bit of a spaz and doesn't exactly follow your movements the way you'd want it to, so any silly mistakes it makes can end up hitting you hard. Humorously though, there are many ways to cheese it thanks to holy water, lightning magic, or even just getting in front of him with Grant. Finally, a boss I can actually shank to death. Getting to Draculas Castle is where all routes and paths converge for the final batch of blocks. Block 8, the main hall, is where we start, and it's not only a nice callback to Castlevania 1's first stage, but it's a return to more traditional level design, figuratively and literally. This is because Block 8 brings you back to the basics and lets you refamiliarize yourself, giving you familiar enemies and setups you have come across earlier. This is important to do with level progression, as while levels generally go up in difficulty, it should not adhere to it strictly. It's okay to have a bit of a breather, and if you're coming out of Block 7 from the lower route, the relief will undoubtedly feel amazing and earned. And which better character to tackle a more straightforward section than with Trevor Belmont himself? Unfortunately, Dracula's Curse keeps damage inflation through the game, so by this point, everything is doing 4 damage. This also includes the fast enemies and projectiles, and with how the challenges get ramped up in the next few blocks, it can be very punishing and demanding for many. This also applies to the physically frailer characters. Since Grant and Sypha take 1 more point of damage, they will start dying in 4 hits by the time Block 4 or 4A is reached, and although they are taking 5 damage by Block 8, it's still a 4-hit kill, so the extra damage doesn't matter anymore. Interestingly, the boss of Block 8 is Death. Normally you fight the Grim Reaper just before Dracula, but I guess Dracula wanted to hype up the danger Doppelganger could bring and assigned Death to the more macabre looking stage. Regardless, I really like Death's fight for his large spectacle. He behaves like his old self from the first game, but is more fair and reasonable to beat, even with just the whip. This is because Death has less health, the sickles are slower and much more reactable, but more importantly, the lower floor gives both you and Death much more room to maneuver. Despite his easier pattern, Death brings on a second phase, which up to this point was a privilege only Dracula was afforded. Now Death becomes a massive skull that loops clockwise and even wraps around the screen. While he only spits 1 sickle at a time now, the mentality has shifted to using the high platforms to avoid Death's large sweeping movements. It does make this second form much easier, but this is the game's last chance at mercy before the glory that is Block 9, the Inner Tower. Yeah, I said it. Without a doubt, Block 9 is my favorite stage in the game, and I'd go as far as to say it's the best on an objective level. The abstract aesthetics, like the forest and waterfalls, feel right at home here, as they are a reflection of Block 9's philosophy. There is nothing new here, but prior challenges with enemies and gimmicks are brought back and amplified in a powerful concoction, just enough to define what I like to call true difficulty. The challenge is pushed much higher than anywhere else, but you are still given full control and awareness of every situation. The stage tests your memory and reflexes on how these enemies and hazards worked, and checks if you can switch gears going from one room to the next. Everything is tougher and stricter, but foreseeably reasonable. Warming you up are the harpies who drop hunchbacks and the spike presses, followed by this killer combo of bone pillars and shield gargoyles. Both enemies complement each other really well in this vertical climb, as they both follow set patterns, and given you are mostly on stairs, it's a section that fully expects you to pay perfect attention to everything the enemies can and will do and act on them in advance. When you survive that section, you'll come out of it feeling like you really earned that victory, like you actually came out of that section a better person, and that's one of the best feelings a video game can give you. The last thing I want to talk about with Block 9 is this collapsing ratchet tower, which has the gall to place a 1-up off the beaten path. It's one of the best 1-up spots in the game, as it looks suspicious enough to pique your interest, but challenging enough to actually make you work for it, regardless of your character. Across the game, there are several moments where brutal challenge is taken too far. I never talked about the game's difficulty specifically, but it does earn its reputation as one of the hardest NES games out there. Of course, you can make it easier, but you'll inevitably come across some sections that get pushed into cheap and unfun territory. Block 6 has one section where you walk from platform to platform above a pit, but rarely these platforms can desync and force you to jump across them, which is made unintuitive thanks to the low ceiling and upcoming spikes. Block 7 has this horrendous platforming section that I skip every time if Grant and Alucard are available, because coming here with only Trevor puts you at the mercy of collapsing blocks, moving platforms that you can't stick around on, and bats knocking you off whenever they feel like it. There's actually one bat that is specifically designed to knock you off if you jump way too early at the end of the initial moving platform streak. Block 10 is one of a few blocks that immediately throw enemies at you when you first enter that block, which can punish you very much for not paying attention right away. Block 10 also has this one bone pillar guarding the front door placed in a very awful position. There are collapsing blocks just in front of it, and because of the enemy's health, you do not have enough time to defeat it before all the blocks fall down. Plus, it's supported by bats, and not even the stopwatch can help you out. Thus, the only way I can reliably get past that enemy without getting hurt is by lobbing an axe from as far as I can, or using lightning spells, and even then, both methods feel like cheating. Block 10 also has a very ridiculous checkpoint, because dying to Dracula sends you back to the block's second section, instead of at the start of the castle keep. It feels needlessly tedious, because the rest of the stage from here is actually rather easygoing. Yes, there is the pendulums with the bats trying to knock you off, which is a challenge I do like, but my point is, this death setback is purely artificial. With the first game, once you reach Dracula, every death and game over simply kept you at the castle keep to continue rematching him. Dracula's Curse is more merciless, and won't hesitate to put you all the way back at the start of Block 10 if it so much as smells a game over. Despite all the struggles you'll go through to reach this point in the game, the final boss fight with Dracula is absolutely worth it. Because Death already pulled the two-phase trick, Dracula amps it up with 3 well-designed phases, and each of them are coordinated so well it culminates in the single best boss fight among the entire NES trilogy. As a vampire wizard, Dracula uses a scepter to generate flames around and under you, and if you stay close to him, he'll trap you. It's a clever way for him to force distance, and since he doesn't have too much health, it's a good warm-up before his more wacky transformations, each raising the intensity of the music. These bizarre heads, connected by one brain, aimlessly float around and drop blood. Despite the tame pattern, you'll want to defeat him quickly, and it's always disturbing yet satisfying to hear these heads scream in agony as you melt their skin away. The final form is the coolest, as Dracula becomes a giant gargoyle bird to zap you with lasers from his head and hands. Because of his size, you have to use the moving platforms to reach his head, though these same platforms also come from the ground and create pits. Even though this fight can be very tense, I really like how his attack order and platform movements are fully patternized and scripted. With how much stuff Dracula stacks against you, it's more so a nice relief knowing about this information instead of it being a detriment to the battle's difficulty. After you beat Dracula, you get this gracious ending. Well, actually multiple endings can be seen depending on which partner you had or didn't have. Each character takes time to reflect on their journey, with Grant hoping to rebuild the town of Wallachia, Alucard having doubts about killing his own father, and Sypha falling in love with Trevor. And although Trevor by himself had to return to the shadows soon after, he would become a pivotal moment of the Belmont ancestry, elevating the status of his name to be honored by all people. After you beat the game, you can tackle Second Quest, which I don't think needed to be in this game. Unlike the first game, there are no new goodies to find with this one. There are some unique enemies, but the skulls who replace the Medusa heads are insane and erratic with no comprehensible behavior. Considering that you'll keep taking at least 4 damage still, it is not worth the hassle, especially given how the first playthrough of Dracula's Curse already gives you a satisfying challenge to overcome. So in the end, I have 33 pros and 16 cons, nearly a 2-to-1 ratio. Without a doubt, I have full confidence in saying I love this game. All the new mechanics and presentation upgrades elevate this game's charm tenfold, and are the reason why I can sink hours and hours of replay value into this game. Dracula's Curse manages to seek out that perfect balance between the complexity of modern gaming and the simplicity of retro gaming. Despite the issues I mentioned, this game is undoubtedly one of Konami's best works, the embodiment of a true classic, a monumental effort that stands the test of time. So with that, I'm going to give Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse my first ever rating of 9 out of 10. Amazing! Well, that's the end of this review. If you like what you saw, consider giving a like and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment if you have something to say. And as per usual, my Discord server, DeMontropolis, is in the description, so consider joining if you're new to the channel. Now that I've covered 6 games of this franchise, it's gotten me intrigued in future games of Castlevania. Given Castlevania 3 is my first 9 out of 10, how does that bode for everything else past this point? I haven't played very many games past this one, and the Metroidvanias are fully uncharted territory for me. So let me know down below if you think I should either put more focus on Castlevania games, another series I've covered before, or something new entirely. I'm interested in what you guys have been thinking about. And one more thing, if you like Castlevania 3's soundtrack as much as I do, check out the description to listen to the music I used for this video. It's a hybrid mix of both the NES and Famicom soundtracks, taking the best quality of each, and I'd strongly recommend giving it a listen. And with that said, I'll be signing off. Take care, folks.